Welcome everybody to this week's really exciting LUMIX Live session. A lot of you guys that have been joining us, every week for the last couple of weeks have been asking relentlessly when we were going to have a stream and information about the ProRes RAW release for the LUMIX S1H, and it is finally here. So we have a really packed conversation today with both PhotoJoseph and Matt Frazer again. So my nemesis is joining us again. And this is going to be a really interactive, kind of conversation. We're going to cover a lot from the actual capture of how you're doing this with the S1H and the Ninja 5, how you're actually recording it in camera, and then also going over some of the outputting, so the exporting side of this as well. So to get this out of the way, if you're new to the LUMIX live streams, welcome. These streams happen every week on Thursdays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and we cover a wide variety of topics, everything from tech-heavy topics to interviews with photographers, ambassadors, and even some of our own internal team members. So definitely join, definitely subscribe, hit the bell icon, all of that fun stuff that you hear numerous YouTubers say about their channels, and join us each week. If you want to interact with any of us on this stream, make sure to drop comments down below or on the side by tagging at LUMIX Cameras. This way we see them in here when we are having the conversation, and if it's something relevant to the topic we're covering at the moment, we'll jump over and answer it. Otherwise, at the end of the stream, we'll kind of run back through the list and see what kind of questions we've got to see if we have answers for you. So with that, I want to bring in the team here. So like I said before, I'm joined with PhotoJoseph, LUMIX Ambassador, and Matt Frazer, Business Development from Panasonic LUMIX. How are you guys doing?
Pretty good.
Nice. I'm actually personally offended. You said this is going to be a really exciting one. I was on last week's. I thought that was pretty exciting too. So I'm offended personally by that.
But I wasn't there, Matt. So Sean knows. Sean knows.
All right.
Besides, Matt and I hate each other, so
yeah,
that one's
true.
never gonna die. That one's just gonna keep perpetuating for a long time. So
yeah, perpetual animosity. Perpetual animosity.
Yeah, it's all good. So the time has come. This, I know, as you guys have been working on these projects for a long time now. I know, Joseph, you were very core in the release of a lot of the educational content with this, and Matt, you've been core in working with our engineers in Japan on, what needs to be done in this. People are just super excited, but there's also a lot of misconceptions and misinformation out there about what ProRes RAW is, how it works. And I think we can use this stream to really kind of get everyone comfortable with this really exciting new format to be able to record with in the S1H. So I figured a good point, as we were talking before about this, to start off on is, what people need to do to get their camera and the monitor set up ready to go for this. A lot of people online, with the way Atomos is doing this for the current time being, it's a little confusing for some. So Matt, Matt and Joseph, whoever wants to give us the answers on this one, what's the first thing people need to do?
All right. Well, why don't we start with the Panasonic perspective, and then we'll go to Joseph from there. So first off, it's just important to note that we're going to have that our firmware is final. It's firmware 2.1. So you can, if you just search, S1H firmware 2.1, you'll be able to get our download link and pull that video down, pull that firmware down. Or Joseph's got an awesome video that he's got on his YouTube channel that walks through the entire process. You're welcome to check out his site. I would actually urge you to check out this video because it really does walk you through how to shoot, how to edit, and how to work with the new LUT. So it makes it very easy for you to understand this. But first would be to get the firmware for our camera and get it loaded. The second step would be you email Atomos. Their firmware is in beta, so they're trying to make sure that they're getting it out to people who understand how to work with it. So there's a little bit of a process of sending an email. They'll then send it to you to be able to use. That's going to be a real short period of time. Don't expect this to be in beta for like a year or anything like that. It's going to be a very short period of time, and then eventually you'll be able to just download it as a standard firmware update for your Ninja 5. So it's just a short period of time that you have to do it this way.
Yeah, and let's talk about how to actually get the files. As you said, for the S1H, it's just a download. Um, as you said as well, on my website and on my YouTube channel, there's links to all of this. And from there, you'll see there's a direct link to the download page for the Lumix firmware. And there's even the email address right there. You just click on that. It'll create an email for you to request the firmware from Atomos. And that takes maybe a half a day or so. I actually did it myself just to experience the process. And it took about half a day before I got the confirmation with the download link. So it's pretty straightforward.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah.
So
I want to add one thing real quick. Sorry, but about updating on the S1H itself, because I know people will, of course, try to do the update without watching the video. And one of the big common questions, things people run into, is they'll load the update onto their SD card and go to do the update, and the box that says update firmware is not available. It's grayed out. And the tip there is you have to disable Bluetooth on the camera to do that update. I have no idea why, but that's just one of the facts. You have to disable Bluetooth, and then you can run that update.
just so you know, I don't know why either. So that's not, you're not the only one confused by that. We all are wondering why.
Some of the engineers are going, why is that now? so that's pretty cool. You know, obviously when there's like any technology that's at the bleeding edge and, you know, for a category, you know, the adoption rate's going to be fairly high, especially with when I talk and interact in the Facebook groups and the different forums that our Lumix users are on. I know, like we said, everyone's been excited about it. So the fact that it's out there, the Atomos side of the firmware update is moving along really quickly. You know, there's going to be a lot for people to start being able to use. Outside of just the recorder and the camera, I know that we've seen a lot of people asking about things, you know, for cabling and, you know, SSDs, a lot of that kind of stuff, because this may be new for some users that haven't really worked with external recorders. Could you guys give us some insight on, you know, recommended cables, what people need to look for in HDMI cables, and even if you guys have comments on what SSDs you know tend to work better for this?
I use 5,400 RPM hard drives, and they seem to no. It's not gonna be right.
That might not.
So
micro discs.
3/4 floppy. Anybody? So I think obviously the first connection is between the camera and the recorder, and there's some confusion because, you know, there's different standards for connectors. There's HDMI 2.0. There's HDMI 1.4. And some cable companies will tell you that they're 2.0 or 1.4. That's not really the number you want to look at. What we want to know is what's the data rate. So you want to make sure your HDMI cable is 18 gigabits per second. That's capital G, lowercase b, lowercase p, lowercase s. If it's 18 gigabits per second, that's the data rate you need to be able to pass the signal from the camera to the Atomos recorder. Obviously, Atomos makes their own HDMI cables that are 18 gigabit compatible. I believe they say they're HDMI 2.0 compatible, but they're correct and they'll work. But there's also 18 gigabit cables from a lot of different companies that you can use with this. That's the first thing to make sure you do. And it's not that easy to figure out if you already have cables in your collection, because it's not like they print that on the casing. So you may want to make the investment in a new HDMI cable if you're planning on doing 5.9K capture with the camera.
Yeah, it's a good point, because I've heard from users already who have the camera, they've got the recorder, they get the updates, and it's working in 4K 60 just fine, but they switch to RAW and the screen goes blank. And I've had one person already who confirmed it turned out to be the cable. They get a new cable and now it's working. So you definitely need to have that high speed cable. It's interesting. I'm not digging on anybody, but it is interesting that people will spend the money on the S1H, will spend the money on the Ninja, but then want to just use a generic cheap HDMI cable. And you do need a good quality cable. These cables don't have to be crazy expensive. You can find 18 gigabit cables for a really good price, frankly, but you do need the right cable.
And I think it's important to note we're on the bleeding edge of that data rate. You know, we're using almost all of it at this point. So shielding on the cable becomes equally important, because if you get a lot of noise injection, a cable that seems to work perfectly fine in your home, all of a sudden you get out someplace where there's maybe a lot of RF interference and you can run into some challenges there. So I'd always recommend that you invest in a cable that's got pretty good shielding so that you don't run into those problems. And then Joseph, I know I was joking about using a 5400, RPM hard drive. When you first got the Ninja 5 and were given this new firmware, which you had it way early, I think you tried to use a hard drive and it didn't work so well for you initially, correct?
Wait, are we talking capture or edit? Capture wise,
capture, yeah, because you would initially try to use one of your SSDs and it didn't work very well.
Right. So I have, because I've been shooting with Atomos hardware for a long time, so I have for years, and I have stacks of SSDs that are in the trays and so on. And I hadn't actually been labeling them very clearly over the years because, when you first start, you're like, whatever, it's just an SSD. And then you go, oh, wait a minute, speed matters. So with the Ninja 5, this is kind of we can get this in the light so you can actually read it from Angelbird. This is the Atom-X drive, and this is the miniature version. It's a smaller drive, so it fits behind the Ninja 5 without sticking out. And that's, it's not a cheap drive, but this is absolutely going to work. So that's a route to go if you're going to go buy a new drive. You may as well get that one. And that'll definitely solve. There you go. That'll definitely solve your issues.
And this is the four-digit company whose name I won't say, but you guys could probably read it pretty quickly on the camera there. Yes, they also make the same style cards, the Atom-X hard drives, and they work tremendously. And yes, you can find SSDs that are going to work with the Ninja 5 that aren't the Atom-X ones.
Sure.
I just know these will work.
Actually, if you go to the Atomos website, if you go to the Atomos, right, they'll stick out. If you go to the Atomos website, they do have a list of tested, known compatible drives. And I guarantee you, like any good tech company should, if you buy some other drive and it's not working, first thing they're going to do is say, well, what drive are you using? Is it on this list? It's not. We can't help you because clearly they can't test every single drive in existence. So, go to their website, check out the list of drives there, find one that you're happy with, and get that.
Yeah,
exactly.
So there's a couple questions that came in, and one question actually came in that I haven't been able to test with my setup here. Maybe you guys can give us a little bit of insight on this. Brent is asking what comes out of the HDMI out from the Ninja 5 when you're feeding it the raw signal. Is it able to be looped out to a Teradek or something else like that?
No. Well, I guess it depends on the order. Okay? So if we're going to come out of the camera and go into the Ninja 5, there can't be a Teradek in between. It's not going to work. I can't take a Teradek and transmit from that Teradek back to a Ninja 5. So if the goal is that you want to fly this on a drone and transmit back the raw data to a recorder off the drone, that's not going to cut it. It's not going to work. But if the goal is that I have Tent City and I need to be able to transmit what the camera is seeing back to Tent City for the client or the director, you can come out of the HDMI out of the Ninja 5. And this was a mistake that was made in some content. It was added very last minute by Atomos. But even the 5.9K can be sent back out the HDMI through a Teradek. It won't be 5.9K. It's going to be a lower resolution, something that's actually supported by the HDMI standard. But you can send it back to Tent City. So it just depends on what the person's trying to accomplish. If they're trying to reduce weight on a drone, it's not going to work. If they're trying to just transmit the image back to Tent City so they can show the client, as long as you come out the HDMI out of the Ninja 5, it should be fine.
Good to know. So hopefully, Brent, that answers your question, and confirming it would be, the setup would be camera to Ninja to Teradek, or the other output source that you're sending it to. So hopefully that clears up.
Or a pterodactyl. You could do that too. Never mind. It's a bad joke. That was stupid. Go on. They're not all winners, kids. They're not all going to be funny. Go on.
Cool.
Let me know when you find one that is.
Yeah.
Oh, that's mean-spirited. That was just hurtful.
So talking about that, with the HDMI cables, that's key to make sure you're getting the proper cables and how you can fit this into the workflow. I know for those, there are a few people I know out there that are debating whether or not they want to go this route with an external recorder and be able to do this kind of recording with it. Originally, we were going to talk about mounting solutions and things like that, but I think a lot of the people in the chat may already have mounting solutions like camera cages. But for those that don't have a cage, you go online, you can find those super simple little HD or hot shoe to quarter 20 little ball head things, and those things will get you by just fine. But talking about that, branching a little bit out, Matt, I know that there are a ton of cages out there that work really well for the S1 or the S series in general. Off the top of my head, I cannot remember the names of the companies, but I'm sure you do. Which could you give us just a list of where people might be able to look?
Well, just keep in mind, I have no favorites. They're all like my children, so I don't have any favorites. But obviously, Zacuto makes cages that are for the system. Tilta makes cages for the system. You have Shape is making cages for the system as well. Wooden Camera has a whole series of options that are available for the camera. Those are the ones that I've personally worked directly with, and we supplied them with CAD drawings of the camera well ahead of the shipping date. There are other companies that make universal cages like Fathom that make a nice cage as well. Any one of these cage brands will have a solution for you. What's interesting with like the Zacuto cages is that they do have an interesting mounting solution for the monitor for the Ninja 5 that I'm pretty partial to, just the way that its system works. But again, they're all great cages and they all do a lot of really cool stuff. One of the cool things you can do with like the Tilta cages is the way that you can control focus from their grip. They have a really cool grip accessory that allows you to pull focus with your index finger. Zacuto has solutions with their systems for being able to pull focus as well. At the end of the day, cages are so much a personal choice, and whether or not you just want to throw a cheese put on the bottom of the camera and monitor through the hot shoe. We're not in the market to try to endorse anybody's particular solution. The nice thing with cages is that it gives you ways to mount other things onto the camera.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been using the small rig cages. I've got different ones for a lot of the cameras that I shoot with, and they've been very good. I like them a lot. They fit really nice. Tons of options for mounting other pieces to it. So those are the ones that I personally work with the small rig.
Cool. Perfect. Cool. So now is probably a good time, since we went through the, how you actually set the camera up, get it all activated, all that kind of fun stuff. What do you actually do with this? How do you capture this in the camera? There are certain steps that you want to follow to make sure that the camera is set up right. So could you guys walk us through a step, maybe not necessarily a step-by-step, but a guide of what you need to do to actually start recording once you have everything attached?
Okay, so let's why don't I do the meat and potatoes, and then Joseph can really cover how you shoot with the product because of his experience with it. So the first thing you're going to need to do is when you update your Ninja 5 in its firmware, and remember that you may be watching this video several weeks from now where you're not actually doing this with the email. You may just be doing it at a download direct from Atomos. Either way, you're going to need to activate ProRes RAW. So ProRes RAW is something that you have to get approval from Atomos to load. So you go to Atomos's website, and it's going to ask for the serial number of your Ninja 5. You enter the serial number, they give you an activation code. You enter that into the Ninja 5, and that'll activate ProRes RAW in the camera. So once you've done that, it's now ready to record ProRes RAW. Once you've done that on the camera, it's really so you have the different tabs. It's the second tab with the motion picture symbol. You'll have an option just below. It's a few options below where you can choose the frame rate and shutter speed of the camera. I'm sorry, frame rate and resolution. It's called RAW, HDMI RAW. You just turn that on. Once you turn that on and you connect the HDMI cable to the Ninja 5, the Ninja 5 will tell you, this is RAW, I'm going to switch to ProRes RAW. And it just sort of does it automatically. It's a very easy setup. I think Atomos has done a pretty fantastic job of making this pretty much witless. You don't have to know what you're doing. Just connect the two and it works. Once you've done that, it automatically matches the output resolution coming from the camera. So if you're in the C4K region, which is a Super 35 crop, it'll automatically be in that, and it'll automatically match the frame rate as well. If you're in 5.9K, it'll do that. And then eventually, when you're in the Academy, or what we call the anamorphic mode, that'll also be working on it as well. So that's automatically just communicated, and then you're ready to record. Did I miss anything, Joseph? Because it's probably good if we just have you verify.
Yeah, I think you got it all right. Kind of dozed off there for a minute, but you enabled the HDMI out. Time code on the HDMI.
You know, that's a good point, though, because Joseph, what I talked about, you'd have to press the record button on the recorder, but we have a way to make the record button work on the camera, so you can hit the record button on camera and it'll trigger. So what would we have to do to get that going?
Yeah, so that you want to enable HDMI timecode over HDMI out, I think is the name of it, in the menu. And it's on the same page. And again, that's covered in the video as well. But yeah, that will allow you to start and stop the recorder from the camera. And of course, the S1H has, what, 3 different record buttons on it in different positions, depending on how you've got it configured, which is... I thought it was the weirdest thing when I first saw it. I'm like, why does there need to be? And then I start rigging it up. I'm like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Cool. Yeah, and that'll allow you to trigger it from the camera itself, which is great.
Exactly.
So definitely you'll want to do that.
Cool. So once you're all set up there, I know that there's a number of things out there with other cameras that might be shooting or capturing ProRes RAW as well. And there's a lot of things that we're doing with our camera and our system that really differentiate it from the rest of the current cameras that are capable of doing this. Excuse me. Sorry. Matt, could you give us some of that info? I know we talked last week about video tools and things like that, but for those that may have not seen that, what tools are available while you're shooting ProRes RAW with the S1H?
Well, I think the first thing that people should know is that we are offering for full sensor, the full sensor size. We're doing the 5.9K RAW, which means there's no line skipping or binning to deliver that. So you're not going to run into issues with moire or heavy aliasing in the image. That was the design goal, was to give you the rawest of raw image out of the camera. So that's clearly an advantage. Inside the camera, we're going to give you access to a waveform monitor. You'll have access to vector scope. You have access to our Luminance spot meter, which is a little box that you can move around to determine what the exposure value is. All of those things are still active on the camera. You can use the viewfinder. I know that some of the RAW cameras, they deactivate the viewfinder when you do that. We don't. You can use the viewfinder just fine. And then obviously within the Atomos device, you have access to waveform monitor, you have access to vector scope, you have access to false color options. Currently, you don't have all of the zoom options, the ability to be able to punch in, but that's a temporary thing. Again, this is in beta form, so eventually you'll be able to do punch in. You will not be able to do punch in on our monitor in RAW, so there's no punch in option on our camera. You'll have to use the punch in on the Ninja 5. So if you like to do punch in for focus, that'll be a Ninja 5 thing that you'll be able to do. It's also important to note that the reason that our RAW was delayed is because of the color gamut that we're trying to cover with our RAW. So we're looking to cover V gamut, and we're trying to make our camera match as closely as possible what we do with the VariCam, what we're doing with the EVA, so it can be plugged into those workflows. And so it can also be plugged into the ACES workflow, which is the Academy of Motion Picture Sciences workflow that helps us to match cameras like an Alexa or a Red or a C500 from Canon. We wanted to make sure we could fit those workflows. And so it required a bit of a change in the workaround to make it work. And so that was where the delay was making sure that it works without any image quality degradation. And so we put a lot of effort into making sure that it will plug into existing workflows. And that's another reason why it was a bit delayed.
Cool. So with the the kind of overall setup, the S1H is touted with the dual native ISO system, and there are a few people asking questions about, does dual native ISO carry over with the RAW capabilities? Is there a difference in the standard way you'd work with it as far as ISO goes?
I'm assuming you're asking me. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So yes, because it's an analog circuit we're dealing with, you have two different valued analog circuits that are used prior to gain, there's absolutely a clear difference between shooting at ISO 640 and then trying to boost it with boosting exposure in Final Cut versus shooting natively at ISO 4000. It's much cleaner. And so that is a benefit of dual native, is that you can push the ISO much higher. The drawback to having a dual native system is that in order for you to achieve that level of cleanliness, you have to have shot it on that native node. So you just got to remember, if you're in a situation where it's a challenging lighting condition, don't try to cheat it in post. Just shoot it at 4000, and then you can adjust the exposure accordingly later on.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a really good point, because one of the other questions in here from John, there's a lot of conversation going back and forth about this, was that, does the camera decide which one it's going to be on? Does the user have control? And if you've had an S1H in your hands before, you have full control over this. You can either have the camera set to auto and it will ramp its ISO and pick the, when you 640 and log, that kind of thing. Or you can go in and select low or high for which one you want to set it at. So set it at 640 or set it at 4000 if you know you're going to be in those darker scenarios, to get the best out of the platform. So when it comes to the actual shooting of it, there's a lot of, what we talked about before, a lot of misconception about what ProRes RAW and RAW shooting is, what it isn't. The conversations about bit depth, 12-bit, 10-bit, 8-bit, what those are actually getting you. Is ProRes RAW getting you better dynamic range versus what internal is? I would like to see if you and Joseph could give us a little bit of insight on what people should expect with ProRes and where they're going to see the benefits of it versus shooting internally. Maybe, Joseph, if you could start on this one.
Yeah, sure. Let's talk about what it isn't, because I think, like you said, there's a lot of misconception. People see the bit depth and they think of it as dynamic range, and you're not getting more dynamic range out of it. That is not any different than shooting vlog internally. So you're not going to get more highlight, more shadow detail than you would of shooting vlog internally. So that's still there. That's still the same. What you're getting in this 12-bit file is more steps in the colors, so that when it comes to color grading, you can push it farther. You can do more with it. That's the idea there. It's not about the dynamic range. So people who are running dynamic range tests, comparing internal to external RAW, they're not going to see a difference because there isn't one. So that's probably one of the most important things to start with. Another really important one is to understand that the RAW workflow is not for everyone. There are certain things that you have to do in post that you don't have to do with internal shooting, even in vlog shooting. One of the big ones is noise reduction. So internally, the camera applies noise reduction when you're recording the file. So if you're shooting at a really high ISO and you normally would have some noise in the file, internally that gets reduced. And that's how all cameras work. They do internal noise reduction. The RAW signal doesn't have that. And if you're shooting at a really high ISO, and you compare the two side by side, you're going to see a noisier file in the RAW. You're going to go, like, why is this noisier? It shouldn't be noise. It is, because the noise reduction hasn't been applied, and you need to apply that in software. Now, that doesn't mean you always have to, because if you're shooting at a native ISO or at least very close to it, or you're shooting in a well-lit situation, you're not going to see the noise, so it's irrelevant. It's a non-starter. You don't have to worry about it. But as you get into those darker situations, those low-light situations, then that is something you want to consider. Now, because you have control over it, you can get better results, and that's the key for that part of it. While you do have to do more work to get there, you can get a better result than you can shooting internally. So that's something that's important to consider. And adding noise reduction is not, it's a trivial process to do, but it adds a lot of processing time. Your final render will take a lot longer when it has to render that noise reduction on every frame. It definitely increases your render time.
Yeah, I want to add something to this, though, which is that there are a couple of RAW formats that apply noise reduction before they output that image. And while there's a benefit that you don't have to rely on the processing in the computer, which extends your rendering times, there's a pretty significant drawback to doing noise reduction in the RAW file, which is, number one, you have no control over it, so it could look mushy or not give you the sharpness that you're looking for. The second drawback is you could actually introduce banding in the final image, because if the image is too clean and that's what you end up uploading to YouTube, or you encode that, into H.264 for the final deliverable, you could end up with a lot of banding that you didn't experience in the actual raw files. So a lot of times you're trading off one workflow, which is to remove noise, with another workflow, which is to add noise to prevent banding. So it's important to understand that it's kind of a balancing act here between, what the noise reduction is doing in computer, what the noise reduction is doing in camera. And so this is more about, if you're shooting raw, you probably want more control over the final outcome of the image. And that's why the noise reduction isn't applied. So that's just the perspective that Apple takes with ProRes RAW. It's the perspective that we're taking with RAW.
And keep in mind too, if you're shooting, so you've got some really complex set where noise reduction, as you're applying it manually, find, I wish I could apply, I want to apply more to this part of the scene, but less to that part of the scene. You cannot control that in camera, in any camera, but in post, you could literally mask it out and have 2 layers of the same video and mask out part of the scene where you want one level of noise reduction and part of the scene where you want another. So you really do have an incredible amount of control. It just takes work. That's part of this is not for every situation. You're not going to go out and start shooting everything in RAW just because you can, because it will require quite a bit more effort to get your end result. Should we talk about exposing?
Come on, this is the modern market. Everyone's gonna get RAW and go out and shoot a whole bunch of stuff with it.
Sure.
So
which is good experience.
I think
there's
there's one other real benefit to RAW that we didn't talk about here yet, which is you have a lot more colors to choose from. There's a lot more crayons in your crayon box because it's 12-bit, which means that for things like green screen or compositing work, it's definitely going to be a benefit there. So you're not going to have to rotoscope as much around edges to get rid of the, color interactions that happen that create those weird sort of lines around people's heads. So if I'm doing compositing, I'm doing rotoscope, I'm doing compositing, I'm doing green screen work, it's probably a really good idea to shoot in RAW for those applications, just to save you some post-production workflow time. So again, keep that in mind that for that application, it's definitely useful.
Yeah, it's higher bit rate, right? So for your fast-moving subjects, you might see some benefits in there. Like the bit depth is going to come in for things like skies, like a really big smooth blue sky with that very subtle gradation that starts to break up. It's certainly going to break up in 8-bit. You might even see it breaking up in 10-bit and 12-bit. You have that many more colors to work with. Like I said, that many more crayons in your box.
Exactly.
So now talking about bit depth, because I think there's some interesting comments out there about 12-bit ProRes RAW versus 12-bit log ProRes RAW versus 16-bit linear. Could you guys give us some information on that? Because I know that seems to be something that originally you'd think, well, the bigger number's better, but in reality it may not be that case. Give us some insight on that.
Yeah, well, adding in the log and linear to the terminology is extremely important. I think that gets left off a lot. You see people say, well, this camera does 12-bit, that one does 16-bit, and so therefore the 16-bit is better. But like you said, it's linear, not logarithmic, so it is not better. Matt, you want to go a little bit tech deep on logarithmic versus linear? You can explain that better than I can.
Yeah, this is kind of nerdy. This is like super nerddom, but we'll get into it.
Hey, when I tweeted out this event, I promised people this was going to be super geeky, so let's do it.
All right. So the way to look at this is that dynamic range in a linear deliverable. Linear literally means it's in a linear fashion. It's not logarithmically changing from dark to light. It's in a linear path. So when we're looking at how exposure would be captured without banding, without creating banding images, when we're in a linear pattern, when we're in a linear capture, for every stop of dynamic range, we roughly need a bit to be able to capture that. So for us to give you 16 bits of linear dynamic range, 16 stops equals 16 bits. That's the easiest way to look at this, okay? I can fit the same amount of dynamic range. I can fit 16 stops of dynamic range within a 10 or 12-bit file if it is in log. I'm squeezing that content in. Now, it looks terrible. It's flat, it's dull, it's lifeless, it has no contrast. But then I can bring it back in post, and I can grade for that. A linear 16-bit file would have 16 stops, and it would look as if the camera captured it. It would have that native look with the native contrast and the native color information intact. So when we're dealing with 16-bit linear versus 10 or 12-bit raw, it's just important to note that the dynamic range is going to be the same. Now, if we did like a 16-bit log, that would be a totally different topic, and then you're squeezing even more dynamic range into that file. But we're also limited by what the sensor's dynamic range capabilities are. If I don't have 16 stops of dynamic range, but I use a 16-bit file, what am I encoding in the 16th bit if I don't have the dynamic range? And the truth is you're adding noise to the file that's being encoded. And Sean, you're a photographer. You've seen this before with under dynamic range sensors that have 14-bit encoding for the photo file. And does it give you a better image just because it's 14-bit, even though it's only a 12-stop sensor? Or is it actually worse in the end?
Yeah, and that's I think that area where the hybrid users that are jumping back and forth, photographers have had experience with this for a very long time. In the video side, the commercialization and the consumerism in video recording is now starting to show some of those challenges there, where bigger's not always better. You have to work within the confines of the product to get you the best results you can. And I mean, that's always been our kind of goal and direction at Panasonic anyway. Get a better core file that you can then have more flexibility with in post. And I'm not someone who knows and really would ever say that I'm comfortable working in ProRes RAW, but honestly, even I've been able to throw it on my MacBook in Final Cut and be able to actually export good-looking HDR footage, at least for myself.
Well, and I know there's one other point I want to make here. Sorry, there's one other point I want to make here, which is it doesn't matter if it's 16-bit. If you can't record it in 16-bit, you're going to have to transcode it to something else anyways. And there's not a lot of recorders out there. Frankly, I don't know of a recorder that can take HDMI 16-bit RAW and record it into a native HDMI 16, into a native 16-bit RAW format. Atomos is saying that the Ninja 5 will be able to do 16-bit, but it has to convert it to 12-bit log in order to do it. I know that the Neon has the ability through, I believe, SDI interface to be able to record 16-bit linear files. But, a Neon is like, 17 inches in size? So you're going to have to be wire tethered to that device to be able to record it. And that's assuming that they can make that device work over HDMI for this, which I don't know. Obviously, I have no idea. But it's important that people understand that being able to deliver the 16-bit is one thing. It's another thing to be able to record that 16-bit file. And if you're having to transcode it to 12-bit linear or 12-bit log anyways, there's not a lot of benefit to having it.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's necessarily any benefit. Like for the Atomos recorder, which is recording to ProRes RAW, which is 12-bit, there's a new camera that was very recently announced that one of their marketing points is that it's 16-bit RAW output, but that is a 16-bit linear RAW output. And when it hits the Atomos recorder, it is remapping that to 12-bit log. And there is, from what I've been told by Atomos, there's no advantage inherently to taking 16-bit linear, converting it to 12-bit log, to just taking 12-bit log and making it 12-bit log. You're not gaining anything one over the other. It's just two different ways to get to the same destination. So it's, again, those big numbers sound good, but as a linear, there is no real advantage to that.
Well, and again, that's today, right? So today there's no advantage to 16-bit. Eventually, when we have a 20-stop camera with 20-stop sensor, we're going to need these bigger bit depths. And we're probably going to have to work within a log profile to put log into a 16-bit camera. But at this point, it's the same. So there's not much benefit to doing it today.
Cool. So
Absolutely.
to shift a little bit to the next part of this, because we have a ton of people asking questions about workflow. Obviously, the capture side of it is relatively easy, across the board. But when it comes to actually editing, there's a lot of, things that you have to think about. Whether you're a Windows user and you're in Premiere, or you're a Mac user and you're in Final Cut, or even as some people are asking questions in here, what about those that are working in DaVinci Resolve? How can they benefit from this? I know, Joseph, you've shot a bunch of stuff with this. I know, Matt, you've shot a bunch of stuff with this, but I honestly want to get Joseph's opinion first on this.
I agree.
So when it comes to workflow, let's start with Final Cut on this, because I know you have the video about this, and that's probably, I think, where most people first should look at editing with ProRes RAW.
Right. So let's actually, before we get to the edit, just we mentioned we were going to talk about exposing, but we didn't do that. So I just want to hit that very quickly.
Good point.
There's a conventional wisdom that when you're shooting RAW, you should overexpose by 2 stops to get the most out of the sensor. And there is some absolute validity to that, but it is not required. You can absolutely shoot where a gray card measures at the equivalent of 42 IRE as it should, and you're fine. And that's going to be perfectly fine. The advantage of shooting over is there's so much highlight recovery possible that if you shoot overexposed, you have to bring the image down to bring it back to look normal. And by doing that, any shadow that, any noise that would show up in the shadows, which is where noise likes to hide, and you like to hide in the shadows, that ends up getting crushed out of existence. And so by shooting a little bit over and then pulling it down, you tend to end up with a cleaner image than if you shot normal and then had to bring something up. Matt, take over for just one moment. I've got someone at my door.
Yeah. So what Joseph's explaining in this situation is that if you shoot over by a stop or two, you'll have less noise inherent in the file. And then any noise that's there gets crushed out when you normalize the exposure. This is also better for data rates, because if we don't have to encode a bunch of noise, that gives us a smaller file to work with. So what Atomos is suggesting is if you can shoot over, that's a good way to do this. What Joseph is pointing out is that if your workflow is more of a cinematic style workflow or a studio style workflow, where you are metering out, you're putting in your own lighting and everything in, you don't have to deviate from that workflow. You can continue to work that way and not shoot over. But if you're somebody who's not pulling out an 18 gray card and is not, throwing in kicker lights, and you're shooting more of a run and gun style, you're always better off shooting over, because you can bring it back. And that's the point that they're trying to make. And that by shooting over, you're making a smaller file. So once you have a well-exposed file or a slightly overexposed file, now it's time to ingest and start to work with the file. And Joseph, what do you want to point out as the workflow choice for this?
Sure. So it's really interesting, because with the new information that we now have on how we're doing it to get it into vGamut, and this is part of the video that was just released, we have a workflow where you're adding this new custom LUT to the file. And so it requires automatically Final Cut is going to take your file and put it's called just Panasonic RAW, but it's basically your conversion from RAW to log. And then you've got a log to Rec 709 conversion. And that's kind of the standard process. And that's what happens by default when you drag your footage in. But then to get to the full true vGamut, to get the absolute most out of your file, you need to add another LUT on top of that, which is this new custom S1H vlog raw to vGamut. I think that's what it's called. Look. And so this is where you're going to get the absolute best quality. And this can become tedious. Without a doubt, having to add this LUT to every clip can become tedious. And so what we've done, if you look at the video, the workflow that I think is going to make the most sense, and obviously it's going to depend on your workflow, what you're doing, it's totally up to you. But what I think is going to make the most sense for most people is you just add the shots and you don't do anything to the LUTs. You just let Final Cut do what it does normally, and you're going to be looking at a Rec 709-like image. And whether you're working in a Rec 2020 color space for HDR delivery, or you're working in a Rec 709 for SDR delivery, it's the same. You just add it and it's there and it looks great and off you go. And then when you're done with your edit and you're ready to do your grade, or at whatever point you want to start doing a grade, then you go in and you start changing the LUTs. And you can do this globally by just selecting all the files in the browser and changing the LUT in the inspector. And that's the key difference. And again, this is pointed out in the video as well. There's 2 different ways to add LUTs. You can do it in the inspector, or you can do it as a secondary LUT through the effects tab. Anything done through the effects tab affects shot by shot on the timeline. So if you have the same clip, if you've got a 10-minute clip and you use 20 pieces of that in your edit, you have to add that 20 times. Whereas the LUT that is set in the inspector, you make one change to the clip and that cascades everywhere, and you can make that change on the timeline or in the browser, and it's the same thing, doesn't make any difference, and that makes the whole workflow a lot easier. So my recommendation, drop it on the timeline, edit like normal, and then when you're ready for the grade, then you swap it out, go for the vGamut, and then you go do your real work. And so
Sean, just to consolidate this because this is incredibly important, So I want to make sure everybody understands this clearly. When you ingest the video files and they're in your library, which the library is usually on the left side of the screen, on the far right side of the screen is called the inspector window, or there's an option for the inspector window. It's where you can switch between, color grading or what your effects are. There's an option that's an I, that's the inspector window. When you open that inspector window, there's different ways to view the metadata and information that's in your file. It's usually defaulted to a very limited amount of information. You want to turn that over to, I think, Joseph, it's general or custom.
General,
yeah. And once you do that, you can see more metadata. As a function of this, you'll see where it says raw to log. And so that will default to Rec 709. It's gonna default to vlog. So it's gonna default to our log. You don't have to change that. That's the correct setting. It's taking raw, turning it into vlog. There's an option just below that. That is the LUT. And that LUT, as Joseph said, is universal. It gets populated to every one of the clips that's used for that, or that's in that color space. So that's where you're going to want to initially kind of leave it there so you get your edit done. And then you're going to change that to the new LUT. So you're going to do custom LUT. You're then going to load this new LUT, which is a raw to vlog LUT. You're going to load that there. And that will make sure all the files are in the vlog space. And then depending on your workflow, some people like to just hand grade and they don't use LUTs. You're ready to grade at that point. Other people who work with LUTs, now all your vlog LUTs will work perfectly fine. You'll just, instead of using the inspector, you're going to actually use the effects location for your file to make your LUTs added. Just type in LUT, search LUT, and you'll see an effect. You just drag those onto the clips and you can put whatever LUTs you want on. I just wanted to consolidate it, make sure everybody understood step by step exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
It's always better to tell it twice so that people can get it and understand what's going on. So with that, why don't we go and turn it back over to you, Sean?
Yeah.
Well, actually, I'll just add to that one more thing. Let me just add to that. So when we're talking about adding that custom LUT, you have to add shot by shot, and Final Cut doesn't have an adjustment layer. Like Premiere has a layer that you can adjust color on that affects everything underneath it. Final Cut, for whatever reason, doesn't have that natively. However, you can download one for free from anywhere. You just search Final Cut Pro adjustment layer and you'll find it. It's a motion template. It's a super simple thing. It's free. You drag that on, make it as big as you want. And then any of these color adjustments you add to that will affect everything underneath it. It really improves the workflow. Hopefully Final Cut adds that in one day, but there's a very simple free workaround for that.
Cool. So, obviously with ProRes RAW, since it's, Apple's ProRes RAW, Final Cut has, from what I've seen, the best integration with it for right now. But there's also a lot of other users out there that are shooting with, or that are editing with Adobe's Premiere Pro. Could you give us some or whoever has, thinks they can do this one the best with it? What are the limitations with Adobe's Premiere Pro in its current state with ProRes RAW editing? I think probably Matt or Joseph.
Yeah, so it just doesn't support it, right? I mean, as far as I understand it, it's something that Adobe needs to add in, and there's no reason they can't. The ProRes RAW API is an open API from Apple that anybody could add in. It's up to them to do it. So if you're an Adobe user, get on Adobe about it. They're the ones who need to add that in. And like anything, the more they hear about it, the more likely they are to add it.
I think the point is I can ingest ProRes RAW and I can work with ProRes RAW in Premiere. I can absolutely do that. But I'm working in a linear space. I'm not working in a log space. And so I'm going to have some limited dynamic range. If my workflow is a log workflow, and that's what I'm used to, and that's what I've built my LUTs around, and that's what I've built everything around, I'm not going to be able to work within that log workflow with a ProRes RAW file with Adobe Premiere today. That doesn't mean it won't be added in the future. I'm certain that Adobe is aware of this. I'm certain that they're working on it. Software like Baselight already has the ability to work with the files in a raw to log conversion. That's already a part of Baselight as well. So for those of you who are working on $200,000 editing suites, you can absolutely do this today. Probably most of us aren't. So obviously that's a challenge that we're dealing with Premiere now. But keep something in mind. You can always work with transcoded files as well. We can always transcode that file into a log file and just kick them back out through. If you're on Final Cut, that's a very simple process to be able to kick those files out as ProRes 444 files that are 12-bit in size, and then you can go ahead and work, or 10-bit in size or whatever. You can kick those out and start working with those files instead. And that would also be the workflow for DaVinci Resolve. So you would take the file, you would convert it to a ProRes file most likely, and then you would kick that out and you would work with the file from there. And I understand that's not the ideal workflow, but that's the workflow that we have to work with today. And again, there's no reason that you couldn't add this functionality to Premiere, or I'm sorry, to DaVinci Resolve. That can all be added. It's just not available today.
Yeah. So I just want to take a second here and just address a couple of the questions that were in the chat. They're not related to ProRes RAW or anything we're talking about today. Those that are asking questions about things like autofocus and things like that, we are not ignoring you. We do see the questions and we do mark down and kind of get this information over to our engineers. So we appreciate you guys coming in and asking questions and giving us suggestions. This stream, the topic of the stream is not autofocus. So feel free to leave the comments and questions in there. We are seeing them. We just don't have answers for you guys on this stream because we're covering a different topic. So yeah, just wanted to get that out of the way. I always hate when someone feels like we're ignoring them or bypassing something in the chat. We are not. We are listening. So back on topic with this part, I know, so we've kind of covered the Final Cut workflow, the current issues with Premiere on ProRes RAW, and then the ways that you can get it over to those using DaVinci Resolve. One thing that I do want to cover, because I don't think I heard it mentioned with the Adobe side of this, is that if you go to Adobe's site, they are also very clear that you have to be using an NVIDIA graphics card, utilizing the CUDA technology that NVIDIA has to be able to work with this. So if you have an AMD graphics card and you're in AMD's camp for that, unfortunately, that is a limitation of the current development with Adobe side. None of us here are going to have answers as to if they're working on those kinds of things or if Atomos is working on support in different recorders, but know that I think what Joseph said was kind of a really good point. The questions that you have or the suggestions that you have for Atomos and Adobe and Final Cut with Apple and Resolve, get those things to those companies. Get your questions in, get your comments to them, because the more they hear the questions and issues that you guys may be having, the more likely you are to actually see updates come from them or get some sort of answer from them on that.
Hey, Sean, one thing I want to make sure we touch base on. So you mentioned the need for a specific style video card on a PC.
Yes.
Because you have to have CUDA cores. I just want to make sure people understand that's not the same limitation on an Apple computer. So they have metal optimization built into Premiere now. So you don't need that for an Apple computer. That's a Windows-based computer need.
Yeah. So there's a couple questions as well out in the chat here about monitoring the. We're going to jump back a bit to the actual camera because again, as I realized, we have a whole lot to cover and we didn't actually talk about this one. So when you're using ProRes RAW on the Atomos Ninja 5, what monitoring options are available for you, and when would you use one over the other? Joseph, I know you've shot a lot with this. Could you give us some insight into your experience?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, when you switch over to RAW in the S1H and the Ninja 5 switches into its RAW recording, it's going to load up a PQ, perceptual quantization mode, and it's kind of amazing. Like what you're looking at there, the image quality you see is so bright and has so much detail, and it's an incredible little monitor. And that, I think for most uses, that is where you're just going to want to stay. You can switch, you can load custom LUTs, but that's going to really show you everything that you're capturing. And in conjunction with that, as we all know, relying on the monitor for exposure only is a bad idea. You want to look at the waveform. There's a nice waveform monitor in there. You can make it a little bit bigger if you want it, and it can stretch across the bottom of the screen. And then you can very easily verify that you are not clipping your highlights. Just like shooting, this is no different than shooting 8-bit. You know, if you clip your highlights in 8-bit, they're gone. It's the same thing shooting RAW. If you clip your highlights, they're gone. You just have a whole lot more room to work within before you clip. So keep an eye on the waveform monitor. Don't clip your highlights, which is pretty hard to do. I mean, if you are looking at the image on screen and it looks normal, there's no way you're clipping your highlights. So you would have to be pretty high over to be clipping the highlights, but have that waveform monitor on there. It really gives you an idea of where you are. And generally, if you're shooting just let's call it a normal outdoor bright sunny day scene, you want to expose it so that your highlights are near the top, obviously not clipping, and don't go too close so that if there's any little flashes of light, they don't get clipped out, but keep it up there, keep it high. And that's going to be part of that kind of overexposing when you shoot. If you leave it at its baseline, you're going to have a huge amount of headroom in the highlights, way more than you need. And so again, back to that discussion of overexposing by a stop or two stops to get the most out of it.
Well, and something I just want to add to that real quick. If you use the 709, which obviously looks very similar to what's on the back of the S1H, you may look like you're clipping something because you're evaluating it in that 709 space, when in reality, it's still there. And so by doing it in PQ, you're seeing a much better representation of the information that's actually in the file. And so sometimes you can just get tricked by that 709 look, thinking that you're clipping stuff, and that ends up forcing you to expose darker so that you can see the information in the clouds. And then ultimately you've shot too dark, and that means you're going to have to lift in post. You're going to have a lot more noise issues. And so the nice thing with that PQ is that it will show you without any doubt whether or not you have clipped. If it's clipped in PQ, it is gone. If it's clipped in 709, it may still be there. So just as something to keep in mind.
Yeah,
and I think Matt clarified this for me, because I've set mine up differently. When you're looking at the waveform monitor on the Ninja, there you're seeing the full 12-bit. You're seeing the full wave. If that same waveform though on the camera itself, that's still a Rec 709 wave, right? So that one you should not rely on when you're shooting in RAW. Am I remembering this correctly?
No, it's showing you the RAW. The waveform monitor is showing you the RAW. So it's showing you the log. Sorry, it's showing you log. So it's limited to what the log space is. So it's not gonna go above like 79 IRE, and it's not gonna go below 10 IRE. Whereas what you're seeing is the true. So
you can still rely on the waveform. Okay, so you can still rely on the waveform on the LCD on the camera when shooting in RAW?
You're supposed to be able to if your workflow is going to be log. If your workflow is log, then you should be able to trust what's on the camera. I will say that in the preliminary betas that we were playing with, there were some deviations there between what was on the two devices. And I haven't gone through and done my thorough testing to 100% verify that it's all been corrected, but that's the way it's supposed to work. It's supposed to be, you can trust it as long as your workflow is log.
And the reason that I didn't know at this point is because just to show another feature in there on the S1H, you can cycle through the display button, cycles through the views that you see on its own LCD. And because you've got your full image way bigger on the Ninja than you do on the back of the camera, I always cycle that through to show the info screen. So it's just a big screen that shows me my shutter angle, my aperture, the ISO, everything on there. And that's super handy to have. And so being able to put all that data there and then just have the image on the Ninja is a really nice way to work.
Absolutely. And you can trust what the Ninja's showing you. So.
Yeah. And so one of this is, I think, one of those points too, where there's the other tool that we have built into the S1H that I think those that are trying to get comfortable with, what to look for on the waveform could really benefit them. And I know, Matt, you love it, the Luminance spot meter on the S1H. The fact that it still works on the S1H while you're outputting ProRes RAW and tells you how many stops over and under you're exposed, I know for me has actually been really useful in seeing, okay, if you know that you can get roughly 6 stops over, maybe more, for your highlights, knowing that I can put that on a highlight point, see how, hot that point is, go into my shadow, see how dark that shadow is, if I'm shooting to maximize the amount of dynamic range I have, then helps me look at the monitor and say, oh, okay, well, that's what I need to look for if you've never used one before. It's a pretty cool little feature there. There are a couple people asking some other questions here that I'm not sure of, and I don't know if any of us are going to have answers for. But one of the questions, and I know, I think actually, Matt, you and I have texted about it before, is when you're shooting in RAW, or the ProRes RAW out of the S1H, you are in the NTSC or the PAL frequencies for this. So 24, 25, 30, 60, and 30, 60. And yeah, my brain broke a little bit there. Sorry.
How about this? How about this? You have 23,976. You have 25. You have 29,94. I'm sorry, 29,97. You have 30. Sorry, 29,97. You have 50, and you have 59,94. Okay, there we go. That's what you have. I think I know where you're going. Yeah, can I do true 24, like cinematic 24?
Yes.
And the answer is no. No, you can't. I realize there might be some people who want to be able to do that. My understanding is I think there might be a technological limitation. There may be a refresh that has to happen at a certain interval to get the data coming out. We may only be able to do that in standard broadcast approved versions. But that's just a speculation on my part. That's what I suspect is happening. It was asked for. We asked for it quite a while ago. We were just told there was a technological limitation that prevents it. Do keep in mind that shooting True 24 is really intended to match film workflows. So if I'm shooting on, Kodak film stock and I'm using a Panavision camera or an Arriflex, those cameras are shooting at True 24. If we need to cut in a small camera as a crash cam, that's when that becomes very useful. It's not really a usable refresh rate for traditional television in the US or frankly for television in most other countries. You end up having to drop frames periodically, and then you start to have your audio signal begins to drift, and so then you have to correct the audio signal as that drift happens. So for the vast majority of workflows for this camera, there would be no need for a 24. It would actually create more problems than it would help. So there's a technical reason why you shouldn't do it unless you're going to be matching film stock. And if you're trying to do it with a film-based camera, I'd say you have a budget, you can correct the audio cadence issues. So go ahead and shoot 23,976. You'll be perfectly fine.
I'm glad you brought that up as the film workflow, because I think that's something you see a lot on YouTubers is, you have to shoot 24 to make it look cinematic, right? You get this whole, it's cinematic because I shot in 24. And people hear that number 24 and they associate that with film. But a lot of people don't realize that on the vast majority of cameras, unless it's a true cinema camera, it's not shooting 24.00. It's shooting 23.976, which is usually represented as 23.98. So even on cameras now, even some of the LUMIX cameras, you'll see it says 30. What it really means is 29.97. It's a generalization, but 24, true 24, is only useful, as you said, if you're shooting matching to film. Otherwise, 23.98 is what you want if you're trying to get that film look in the frame rate. And I keep using air quotes because shooting 24 doesn't automatically make it look like film. That's a whole other topic, but just wanted to drive that point home.
Yeah. Well, I know we could talk for hours and hours on this, and I know that we didn't get to all the questions in the chat, but we're a little past the hour here, and I want to make sure that the time is respected for everything going on. But Joseph, where can everybody that wants to continue this kind of conversation, where can they find you? I know we've had you on before, but for those that haven't jumped in before.
Sure, thanks. PhotoJoseph, absolutely everywhere. So on YouTube, youtube.com/PhotoJoseph. My own website is photojoseph.com, and all the videos get mirrored onto there as well. Same on Twitter, PhotoJoseph on Twitter. That's probably the best way to reach out if you just want to say hi. And PhotoJoseph everywhere.
Yeah, very cool. And then Matt, everyone can definitely find you on these kinds of streams. I know that. not being one of those social media people out there for the most part.
Yeah, I'm prone to falling. I'm prone to flying off the handle. So I intentionally don't keep a Twitter or Facebook because I like to stay employed. So I'd rather not just fly off the handle and lose my job. I maintain a personal Instagram, and that's literally all I maintain.
Well, like I said, thank you guys for joining us again this week. These kind of conversations are always fun. I know that we always have a ton of information to cover, and like I said, we could go for hours and hours on end talking. But really quick comment for those asking, hope for the Micro Four Thirds people. If we have information about Micro Four Thirds, we will comment on these streams. I don't have information for you guys right now, other than we did just release the G100.
Did somebody ask for a GH6? Did that happen? I can't imagine.
Never.
Yeah, that kind of always happens.
I see Shark in the
comments.
chat, and he is always asking for trying to get information on the GH6 out of me, buddy. It ain't gonna happen.
Exactly.
As soon as they tell us, we'll tell you. As soon as they tell us, we'll tell you. I promise. I promise, we'll tell you.
Exactly.
So what camera did you say was just announced?
Well, we did just drop the G100, which is definitely a fun little camera.
You mean that one right there?
Hey, there it is.
There you go. See, yeah. See, Micro Four
Shameless
Thirds,
product
still got
placements.
Hey,
so,
you brought it up. I want to make
those-
sure people know they're still developing
exactly.
for Micro Four Thirds. Absolutely.
Yeah, we're still building
Exactly,
for it. I
exactly.
promise. There's.
And
You
believe
have to
me,
understand,
for those of you out there who are
we're
concerned,
joking about this. Yeah, we're joking about this because we hear it a lot. And by the way, we're not against hearing it. We're actually really excited. Everybody loves the GH5 so much they want a replacement. This helps
Absolutely.
to drive the point home. So we're good with the questions. Believe me. We just don't want you thinking.
yeah,
we're
I think
ignoring
I
it.
want
That's
to
why
point
we're-
out. Yeah, I want to point out that if anything happened to the Micro Four Thirds line, I'd be one of the first people in line screaming bloody murder about it and bring it back because I love the Micro Four Thirds. That's still what I shoot the vast majority of the time. It's a fantastic format. So yeah, it's not. Don't worry.
Yeah.
We're good.
Yeah. And by the way, just because I said GH6 doesn't mean that's what it's going to be called. So I saw that down there. That doesn't mean anything. It just means I'm using your guys' vernacular for it. It's no confirmation. That's
Exactly. We're just reading off the screen here.
No promises we're going to make a GH6. Just I know that's what you're asking for.
You uttered the words, though, Matt.
I know. I'm going to get an email later on today, I'm sure. I'm certain I'll get an email.
Yeah.
So yeah, for everyone in the comments, everyone that joins us every week, thank you for joining us with these and providing your guys' insight and your comments in the chat. Like I said, we hear everything you guys say. Our teams see the comments. We know how much you guys love the Micro Four Thirds system and the GH line and how much you want to see a sequel or a refresh in that series as well. So it is greatly appreciated that you guys are interacting with us. On the topic for today's session, we loved the comments and the conversations you guys have. We know that we didn't get to everything that you guys had. There are certainly technical questions that were in there that in some cases are actually just easier to handle through emails and text and things like that. But these streams are always designed for you guys, for the crowd out there that, has questions, really wants to understand the equipment. And like I said, we appreciate you guys joining. Make sure to subscribe to the LUMIX Cameras channel, the one you're on right now. This way you'll actually know when we have these other streams coming up. We already have our stream next week posted and ready to go. So make sure you join us next week. It's Thursdays at 2 p.m., same time every week. Make sure you get the bell icon on so that you get the notifications and all that fun junk with YouTube's algorithms and all that fun stuff. And if you're someone who wants to make sure that you're on the cutting edge with information that comes out, so all of you out there asking for GH updates, get on the email list. Go to lumixlounge.com is like the fastest way to get to it, and sign up for the emails. You'll get the emails for only Lumix stuff. You're not going to get a whole bunch of Panasonic emails. You'll get the Lumix related content. You'll know when we have these events going on. You'll also know when we have localized events going on. So again, thanks for joining. We will be back next week with another LUMIX Live session. that week with actually focusing on G100, as we just mentioned it before. Otherwise, thanks again. I don't know how many times I can say thanks. I always am horrible at ending these streams. So with that, goodbye, everybody. See you next week.
Bye, everybody.